Hi, so this sub-unit opens the second unit of the course as a whole, about the use of language in minor literature. If you recall, one of the ways to define minor literature is that it is literature that is written in a language that some would feel does not belong to its writer. A Prague Jew writing in German, a Native American not having a choice but to write in English. The questions that I will ask in this part of the course will be: in what ways does being in this position of a minor writer affect the way minority writers use language, and in what ways does it connect to their identities? The first answer I will offer in this sub-unit is connected to the notion of double identities that we have encountered while reading Du Bois, Dunbar, and Daraj in the past weeks. Some members of minorities, both in literature and in everyday life, do not only have multiple identities or mixed identities or hybrid identities, but express themselves in multiple languages. They move more or less freely back and forth between different languages. This is known as code switching, or sometimes as polyglosia or polyphony when we talk about it in literature. Code switching is alternating between two or more languages or dialects, or maybe even two registers of the language, two styles of the language within one conversation or text, within one sentence or within one paragraph, having two or more languages. The connection to double identity should be quite clear. Each language corresponds more or less to a kind of identity or to one part of your identity. This is very clear with the example of African American vernacular English, or sometimes called Black English. Most African Americans can switch between a more markedly black way of speaking and a more mainstream way of speaking. The African American dialect expresses the black identity, the one that's based in their own community, while the white way of speaking would express an attempt to belong to American society in general. In fact, some black people would refuse to speak in a way that shows too much of an attempt to fit in order they wouldn't want to sound white, because they want to express their own unique identity and their difference from the mainstream society, while other black people would do everything not to sound black because they want to fit into the more mainstream society, where there's also often more opportunity for success. You can find similar switching and decisions not to switch in African American literature. In African American culture, the term code switching is sometimes used in general for the idea of being able to speak in two or more dialects and styles, not necessarily switching within one text, though you could definitely find texts where the author goes back and forth. In the case of African Americans, code switching is between two variants of the English language. African American English is definitely part of the English language. It's one dialect among many. For other minorities, there's a certain level of code switching from language to language, between two different languages. In the story we read by Susan Moadi Daraj, we saw some use of Arabic words, the language of her parents and grandparents, though it was very restricted. There weren't whole sentences in Arabic, only a word or two here and there. In fact, it was Alex, the white boyfriend, who used Arabic the most, borrowing words from Arabic to express his Orientalism. Other minor writers incorporate much more code switching. Immigrant writers do so as well as those who come from immigrant backgrounds. So people who actually immigrated and people whose parents immigrated. They often do need to add some kind of translation to the words imported from other languages, because the reading public doesn't know Arabic or doesn't know Russian. They have to add some translation. Sometimes the code switching is just described, not depicted in the language of the text, like writing that the character said something in a mix of Russian and English without including the actual Russian words. It might even just be implied. The code switching might just be implied. If you remember in Daraja's Chasing Valentino, she quotes her grandfather about the sudden throb of love. And she quotes her grandfather. The quote comes in English, but we can assume that the characters were probably speaking in Arabic. So there's a description of code switching, but without actually bringing in Arabic into the text. Some writers allow themselves to code switch more freely than others, without translations even, and with long swaths of the text in a different language, creating texts that are multilingual. Sometimes it's so extreme that someone who does not speak both languages might not be able to understand the text properly at all. In a way, this restricts the audience to people who speak both languages. One group that seems to be able to afford making this move in the United States are Hispanics. Hispanics are United States Americans from Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas and Spanish-speaking areas in the United States. So they come from places like Mexico and Puerto Rico and Cuba. Writers from Spanish-speaking backgrounds can often afford to insert a lot of Spanish into their writings for a number of reasons. There are a lot of people who belong to this Spanish-speaking minority or community in the US, so the audience is substantial. Furthermore, Spanish is the most taught second language in US schools, so often even those who are not from Latin or Hispanic backgrounds can follow some degree of this code switching. A lot of Spanish words are very similar to English words, so it's not a problema to get what problema means. Finally, a lot of Spanish words are well known to American speakers, just are part of the English language by now. So even a Disney film movie like Encanto can include some code switching within it, even though it's for mostly aimed at children. So the grandmother is called the abuela, and the house is called casita, which is a pet name for casa. And Uncle Bruno is Tio Bruno, but we don't talk about Bruno. That said, including a heavy dose of code switching, even in Spanish, would make the text difficult to understand for a lot of the audience. Or restricting the audience, telling people who don't speak Spanish, maybe this text is not aimed at you. Spanish is not alone in being relatively available for code switching. French and German words can be put into English discourse, though they often will signify sophistication and education rather than any kind of ethnic identity. If somebody uses French words as they talk about fancy food, it doesn't mean that they're French. It means that they have a lot of money probably, and spend some time in France and know how to order fancy food in fancy restaurants. Yiddish, on the other hand, the language of Eastern European Jews, also appears quite often in Jewish American literature, because many of its words, like chutzpah, have become part of American slang. so Jewish American writers and other writers can afford to insert some Yiddish into American literature. The question where a word from another language already becomes part of English slang, or part of standard English even, and when it still counts as code switching is far beyond this video. The important thing to remember is that multilingualism and code switching are important tools for many writers of minor literature, and we should pay attention when we see that in a story or poem by a minority writer, whether they have access to another language or only access to a variance of the mainstream language. The languages really, the author uses is crucial for how they form their identity and how we as readers can understand their identity. In the next video, I will give an example of a text that switches a lot between different variants of English and different variants of Spanish. It also thinks about the meaning of multilingualism in the context of living as part of a minority.